Yesterday we celebrated Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of Trees, which, in practical terms, is a date which functions to demarcate which year fruit belongs to for purposes of calculating tithes. And for purposes of determining for some other halachot related to growing fruit, the prohibition on consuming fruit in the first 3 years of a tree's growth. Tu B'Shvat is the date on which we say that any fruit that appears after that date belongs to the current year, and before that date, it belongs to the previous year. Now, in the Talmud, tractate Rosh Hashanah 14a, Rabbi Elazar quotes the opinion of Rabbi Yoshaya that the date for the New Year of Trees was selected because at this point in the calendar, most of the year's rain has fallen, although most of the winter still remains ahead of us. Now, it's not immediately clear why the date for determining which year a fruit should be said to have grown should be based on how much of the rainfall for that year has passed before the fruit ripens. And so, perhaps sensing a gap in the explanation, Rashi, in his commentary, adds that at this point in the year, not only has most of the rainfall taken place, but the sap has also begun to rise. And the fruit will begin to form after this. So Rashi's explanation, I think, raises its own questions, which are, if the date is all fundamentally about the sap, as Rashi suggests, why bother mentioning the rain? And if it's about the rain, why bother mentioning the sap? Perhaps what Rashi's trying to say is that the moment when most of the rain has fallen is significant because at that point, sap has already begun to rise. And by Tu B'Shvat, the rising sap will be carrying this year's rains, or water that came from this year's rains as opposed to last year's. And a majority of that water, those rains having already fallen, and therefore any fruit that forms thereafter, we can assume is forming from this year's sap, because the sap starts to rise around now, and most of the rain has fallen, so we can say the sap is full of this year's water. So whether we think that what defines a year is when is the tree doing its thing, in which case the sap is relevant, or is what defines a year when did the water hit the ground, in which case the rainfall is relevant. Either way, most of those things have taken place by Tu B'Shvat. Rashi's explanation that Rav Oshaya's explanation in the Gemara help us understand how a date, which on the face of it appears to be simply a matter of legal and administrative interest, comes to be celebrated as a holiday, a spiritual festival by Jewish mystics. Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, is often very focused on the invisible divine processes that give rise to creation, the supernal mechanics through which the infinite transcendent oneness, which we call God, could give rise to and sustain this multitudinous, diverse, physical creation that we all perceive. What better metaphor for the process by which intangible infinity gives rise to corporeal creation than the mysterious hidden processes by which invisible water under the ground is transformed into a juicy piece of ripe fruit, which can delight and nourish us. As I wrote in the St. Louis Jewish Light this week, it's no accident that Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat when we read the Song of the Sea, which our ancestors sang upon crossing the Sea of Reeds, always falls right around Tu B'Shvat, this holiday marking the new year of trees. Because the Song of the Sea celebrates a great miracle which occurs at the beginning of our journey through the desert, a journey whose full fruits will only come later, with the giving of the Torah, and after 40 long years of wandering, our entry into the land of Israel. Tu B'Shvat, like the Song of the Sea, is an acknowledgement of the invisible first step on the way to achieving a tangible goal. We celebrate the beginning of the sap running because without that invisible, easily overlooked first step, there would be no leaves, no blossoms, no fruit. We celebrate the crossing of the sea because without that triumph, we could not have received the Torah or entered the land, even though those accomplishments would only come later. However, the more I think about it, the more I think that even more than the Song of the Sea, and even more than the miracle of the parting of the sea itself, which that song commemorates, I think Tu B'Shvat and this idea of marking the moment when the sap's beginning to run relates to an easily overlooked moment before the parting of the sea, when the children of Israel stood on the edge of the Sea of Reeds with the Egyptians at their backs and the sea in front of them. There's a confusing sequence during which the Israelites look up, realize that the Egyptian army is on their tail, and cry out to God before turning to Moshe and excoriating him for bringing them out of Egypt in the first place, expressing a desire, or at least hinting at a desire to return to Egypt. Nechama Leibovitz points out that they say the word Egypt 5 times in the course of a few verses complaining to Moshe, and suggests that since we say that when God repeats a person's name, it means it's an expression of his love for and affection for them. When the Israelites are repeating Mitzrayim, 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 they're expressing their continued love for the country that enslaved and oppressed them, and which they've just barely escaped with their lives. Moshe responds, not as we might expect by chastising them for being fickle and faithless, for their willingness to return to slavery, for their seeming preference for a life of slavery that is at least secure over the uncertainties of following God into the desert. Instead, Moshe reassures them. He says, "Fear not. Stand still. Hisyatzvu. And see the salvation of Hashem. Hashem shall fight for you, and you shall remain quiet." Thereupon, the next verse, Hashem speaks to Moses and says, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the children of Israel to go forward, and you lift your rod over the sea and split the waters." Now, at first glance, it seems Hashem is telling Moshe, what are you doing? Don't tell them to stand still and trust in me. Tell them to do something. Tell them to get up and walk. But with the people in a panic and demanding, complaining that they never should have left Egypt, do we really think that the best course would have been for Moshe to immediately tell them to march forward? Reassuring the people, telling them, don't fear, just stand still, take a deep breath, and try to trust in God, expect his salvation, was probably healthy, practical, and necessary. Perhaps Hashem here isn't criticizing Moshe for what he told the Israelites to do, but letting Moshe know that the people are now ready to move forward. And even though it's only the space in the Torah of one verse to the next, we don't know how much time elapsed between Moshe's speech to the Israelites saying, don't fear, stand still, trust in, you will see the salvation of Hashem, and Hashem's speech to Moshe saying, why are you praying to me? Tell the people to get up and walk forward, and you lift up your arm and split the sea. Perhaps it was only a few seconds, or perhaps it was much longer, maybe hours. We don't know, but presumably, however long it was, that gap was, it was long enough for Moshe to have begun praying, since God begins by telling Moshe, why are you praying? So there was some gap between Moshe speaking to the people and God saying, Moshe, why are you crying out to me? Long enough for Moshe to cry out, to pray. And presumably it was enough time for something to change within the hearts of the people, for them perhaps to do what Moshe said, to stop fearing, to trust that they would see the salvation of God. And it was certainly enough of a change that they were willing, these people who, the last we heard, were complaining that they never left Egypt in the first place, to follow Moshe's instructions to move forward into the sea. That invisible internal transition from fear and panic happened after Moshe's instructions to stand still. Sometimes before movement can occur, before outward visible change can take place, we need to stop and take time to change things internally. Moshe understood that the people in their state of mind were not ready to march into the sea. And so he told them, take some time, stand still, don't have fear. You're going to see the salvation of God. Often in life, we know where we want to go, but we don't understand why we're not moving in that direction. Maybe we really even not only do know where we want to go, we know what we have to do to get there. But for some reason, we're not taking those steps. Maybe fears and insecurity prevent us from doing so. Maybe that's the case, but we're not even conscious of it. All we know is that we're not moving in the direction that we want to be moving in. And at such times, we could berate ourselves for not taking the necessary outward and visible steps that might seem obvious, might look easy to do. It's easy to walk forward. But as Moshe understood, when you're paralyzed by fear, when you've got an army behind you and the sea in front of you, and all you can think is, why did I leave my comfortable, if difficult, life? It's useless to berate someone for not moving in the right direction. Before there can be outward movement, an invisible internal movement has to take place sometimes. Moshe understood this, which is why he told the Israelites to stand still and not to have fear. He knew that before they could take their first steps towards the water, they needed to take internal, invisible steps to cultivate faith and calm and courage that would allow them to march into the sea. And those invisible steps may not be as dramatic, may not be as impressive, but they are no less difficult, no less real, and no less important than the outward visible ones. Tu B'Shvat reminds us of this, reminds us of the importance of honoring the invisible, internal, secret work that is happening even in a tree that appears completely dormant. Far from being dead or stuck, that tree is doing hard work, moving water and nutrients from the earth towards its branches, which will eventually bring forth fruit. No one would dream of berating a dormant tree in January for not having ripe, delicious fruit on every twig. I hope that we can have at least that much compassion on ourselves. We can be at least as kind to ourselves as we are to a fruit tree. When we find ourselves seemingly stuck, not taking the concrete steps that we wish we would towards our goals, instead of berating ourselves and saying we're lazy, we're cowardly, and whatever other insulting things we say about ourselves in the privacy of our own minds, to explain and criticize ourselves for not being where we want to be. Let us instead, like Moshe, acknowledge and try to understand and support the invisible but important internal work that needs to go on before we can take those concrete steps forward to cross the sea, before we can start bearing our fruit. On Tu B'Shvat, may we all be blessed with renewed energy and compassion for the ways in which we appear stuck. And may we be blessed with the faith to stop, to stand still, and trust that if we give that invisible, secret, internal work the attention it deserves, it will eventually lead to dramatic transformation. Shabbat Shalom.